So in this video, I'm working on another Tennessee Walker Broodmare. And as usual, I'm starting with picking out this horse's hoof to get a general idea at what I'm looking at and come up with a game plan, which in this case is going to be nippers first. The wall is the longest structure by far, so that is what I'm going to remove immediately and then move on to the other structures. But on this hoof, it's going to be mostly hoof wall. And the toe, you can kind of see there's not a ridge by the toe, but there's some beginning of some separation by the toe. So I'm going to make sure that I bring that toe back as much as I can in this one trim, and make sure I get the heels back where I want them to be. But the toe is the main thing I'm kind of focused on. So here I'm doing my vertical nip to bring that structure back a bit and collect this hoof a little bit more and remove any of that delaminated hoof wall by the toe. You can see there's a little bit of a horizontal line within the layers of hoof wall, and that is that delaminated hoof wall. And it's just where the layers of hoof wall have kind of separated from each other, allowing a bit of moisture and mud and manure to get in there, creating further separation. So it's always nice when I can kind of trim it out, and then we don't have to really worry about it anymore. So just finishing my bevel on this hoof, making sure there's no sharp edges back by the heels. And that's about it for that hoof. While I'm working on this hoof from the top, you can see that there's a little bit of lateral flaring. You can kind of see where it starts. It's not very far up the hoof wall. So I'm just kind of removing that area as it would contact the ground. I don't want to thin the hoof wall in those areas too much. Where it's flaring is an area called the quarters, and that's the weakest part of the hoof, and I don't want to weaken it further. So now I'm working on the left hind of this horse, which still beautiful structure. Both the broodmares I worked on at this farm on this day have really nice hooves. They get really good nutrition throughout their lives, and the only time we really see anything wrong with the hooves is when we've had some difficult weather. So this mare, she's not being bad. Actually, none of the horses at this farm are ever bad usually. They stand really well, and that's why I'm able to take videos of so many of the horses that live there. She got a little bit uncomfortable, I think, a few times while I was trimming her. And that's pretty normal for broodmares. They'll have a harder time with their hind feet usually. The way I kind of view it is, I think they get a little bit of sciatica just like humans do. Especially after being in foal and foaling. It just puts a lot of strain on their bodies in certain areas, and the hind end seems to be one of those areas. So I just try to be really accommodating when they're getting uncomfortable. And if they pick up their foot a few times and try to pull it away or move it away, I'll try to bring my stand in the hoof back to a position where they're comfortable. Now that I'm working on this hoof from the top, you can pretty easily see the lateral layer on this hoof. It starts about halfway down the hoof wall. You can see a little bit of a horizontal line there, and that's kind of where the end of the flare is. And traditionally they would have you rasp that off, but I don't tend to do things traditionally. And I found the best way to work on these flares is to remove them from the ground surface as they're growing out. So that looks pretty good. Now I'm working on this horse's right hind hoof, and it looks pretty similar to the left hind hoof. The only thing that's kind of different is they have just a slightly different wear pattern. The other hoof was a bit more symmetrical. This one's flaring a little bit more on the lateral side, and you can see the sole is a bit wider on the lateral side than it is on the medial side, which is very common in big muscled, big bone horses. And right now I'm just doing a nip of the wall, trying to remove as much material as possible with that tool before using my rasp. Now I'm going to smooth all those nipper marks off of this hoof. And you can see I'm kind of rasping through the toe a little bit. Her toes were a little bit long on her hind hooves. And once you know the anatomy of the hoof, you can figure out where you can and cannot rasp that area of the hoof. Right? If this horse was thin-soled and didn't have any concavity, I would be much more careful with trimming in that area around the sole of the toe. But I know this horse, and I know it's not going to bother her, and I know that it's more important to bring her toe back to bring her out of dysfunction. So I'm putting a real heavy bevel on that toe to try to help her with her breakover and give her a little bit better footfall when she's moving. Now I've got that hind foot forward on the stand, and it's really easy to see the flare now and how much bigger the flare on this side is than on the other hind foot that I just worked on. So same thing though, it'll trim out after a few cycles. These mares go a little bit longer as they approach their foaling date and for a little bit after they have foaled. So it'll just take a little bit of time to get this hoof collected again like we used to have it. But overall looks really good and is really healthy. Now I'm working on the last hoof on this horse, the right front. And the first thing that jumps out at me when I picked up this hoof is that there is a big crack in the toe that I'm approaching right now. Oh, I've bypassed it. I'm going to work around that medial side, I guess, first and come forward toward the toe. But that crack, you can kind of see there's a horizontal line in it, which means it's starting to spread horizontally. And when I see that, I generally like to open those cracks up because that means the fungus is kind of taken over on the inside there. And once fungus takes over, it will always outgrow the hoof wall, and we can't really trim our way out of the situation unless we address the crack specifically. So when I'm done trimming this hoof from the bottom, I am going to bring this hoof forward on the stand, and I am going to address that crack with my hoof knife and open it up. But other than that, it's just a normal trim on the bottom of the hoof. I want to bring back the toe where I would generally like it to be. Right now I'm picking out that crack to kind of gauge how deep it goes and how far it's traveling horizontally. And opening it up a little bit with my knife because there was some lamina that was laying over the opening. Just kind of gauge how big of a problem it's going to be. But I also don't worry too much about these things, especially at this place, because I know these horses are on really good nutrition, and even if they get little cracks and stuff like this, they always recover beautifully from them. Looking at this hoof from the top, I'm just going to finish my bevel like I normally would first, so that the majority of the trim is done before I address that crack and open it up. The reason why we open up some of these cracks is to expose them to air and sunlight, which is really nature's best remedy for killing fungus and keeping it at bay. And we also don't want the fungus to travel up further within the hoof wall, because it's kind of like a dark chamber lacking air and sunlight when we get a void like this between the hoof wall and the sensitive lamina. So it's really important to open up kind of that chasm, that crack. And that's what I mostly do on these horses. With my, you can see I just use my nippers to kind of get the big chunks off. And then I'm going to use this loop knife, which is kind of like a medium-sized loop knife. Like the blade isn't too wide and it isn't too narrow. And it's a bloom loop knife. And I love this particular knife for opening up cracks. It's really easy. Well, none of this is really easy, but it's probably the easiest tool for me to open up these cracks besides using a Dremel. And a lot of horses are too concerned about the noise and the feeling of the vibration from a Dremel tool to let me use that effectively to open up cracks. So this is usually my go-to tool for doing this. And as I'm using this knife, I'm really just trying to remove all the black that I can find that's within that crack, because that's the fungus. And that's why it's taking me a while and I'm having to go a little bit deeper than expected, is because there was a lot of black inside of there. But that's also why we are opening this crack up. And I'm just checking it with my hoof pick there to see how much farther I might need to go with my knife. If I had to open up a crack that was much bigger than this, might have to add a little bit of extra support at the end. I might need to patch the crack or add some dental impression material with some medication or some casting to stabilize the hoof capsule so that we didn't create more problems for ourselves. But a crack this size, I just open it and leave it. I'll usually put some medicated clay or dust tin or something like that on it and call it good.
All right.
Thanks for watching, everybody. If you have any comments, please leave them below.